All right. So, like I said, Zechariah chapter 14 is a companion chapter to Revelation 19, which is the Battle of Armageddon, and chapter 22, which is the millennial kingdom, or the millennial reign, and the reign of Christ from the throne. It also is a companion chapter to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11 is also about the Antichrist. It's about the Antichrist and that final climactic battle. So, all right, Jeff. Zechariah chapter 14 encompasses both the lead up to the Battle of Armageddon, and the result of the Battle of Armageddon. So it is a composite chapter that gives us an eschatological viewpoint of the end state of the nation of Israel. And that's a fancy word. Eschatological means the end times. That's what it means, the study of the end times. And if you'll recall, when we're going through Zechariah, I was talking about Zechariah as bringing comfort to the nation of Israel by focusing on the end state, on focusing what will ultimately come from everything that they're going through, right? It was in conjunction with rebuilding the temple, and they were discouraged about the temple being so small. And Zechariah, in essence, says, no, this is serving God's purpose. The Lord sends Zechariah to say, no, this is serving my purpose. Because the ultimate end state of the children of Israel, the nation of Israel, will be a glorious one. And that's how chapter 14 finishes. But it starts in a dark place. So any questions there before we read it and let's talk about it? All right. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. So it's talking about the nation. You can read this in Daniel chapter 11, where the Antichrist has turned on the nation of Israel. If you recall, when we're going through the book of Revelation and these end time events, the Antichrist comes on the scene as a peacemaker. He comes on the scene and wins the hearts of the nation of Israel, of the Jews. They trust him, and he signs a peace treaty with them, and they finally are able to rebuild their temple and think they have security from all the troubles that they have experienced as a people from all time since 70 AD. And then midway through the tribulation period, the Antichrist turns on them. And this is when, in the book of Revelation, we see that the nation of Israel has to flee into the wilderness, the Jordanian wilderness, and God protects them there. Zechariah indicates only half the city is going to be able to go. The rest of them are going to be killed. Okay? And then God's going to come and fight for them. And any questions there? Okay? Verse 4, on that day, the day that Jesus comes back, so we're transitioned to the second advent. This is the second coming. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west, a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azel, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. If you'll recall, in the book of Revelation, Jesus is coming back, and he's coming back with all the armies of heaven on white horses, and we talked about how that is us. We're coming back with him to be observers. Zechariah says the same thing. He says, then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Well, that's us. We're coming back with the Messiah when he stands on the Mount of Olives. And this indicates that in the millennial reign and moving forward, that the topography of the Middle East is going to be changed. The Mount of Olives is going to be split into two. So there'll be a great valley where the Mount of Olives is now. Questions there? On that day, verse 6, there shall be no light, cold, or frost, and there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. Don't really know what that is indicating for us, except that it's going to be a unique day. It's not going to be a day like we're familiar with, where it turns into dusk and then to dark. So whatever is going on that day, and I think Zechariah indicates this, it's a day known to the Lord. And I think by that language, he's saying he doesn't really understand it either. But maybe somebody smarter than me does, but I don't totally understand what that is. We do know that those of us who live in the New Jerusalem in the millennial reign will need neither sun nor moon, because the Lord will be our light. God will be our light. He will provide the light. So maybe it is indicating something along those lines. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Feel free to jump in, because I would love to learn something too.
To me, I mean, it almost sounds like maybe a nuclear blast or something, in the sense like, you know, it changes that cloud, it extends over everything. There's no light. I don't know.
And I think some would probably agree with you from later on in verse 12 and following, that we'll get to in just a minute, that seems to indicate the same thing. So that quite possibly could be happening, but I don't want to give you a definitive this is what that means, because I'm not sure. So needless to say, it's not going to be like a time we have ever experienced, or mankind has ever experienced. This is going to be a supernatural day, a supernatural event. On that day, verse 8, on that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. So like I said, the topography is going to change. Now there's going to be a great valley, and the water is going to flow from the Temple Mount, the current Temple Mount, from Jerusalem to the Mediterranean and to the Dead Sea. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. So we have transitioned. We're getting ready to look at the Battle of Armageddon after we discuss what's going to happen to Jerusalem. The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site, from the gate of Benjamin to the gate of the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's winepress. And it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. Elsewhere, we're indicated that in the millennial reign, Jerusalem will be lifted up above all other places. So the great topographical shift, the great shift in our land masses is going to result in an earth that we would not recognize, right? We're not going to have these soaring mountains all over the place, but Jerusalem is going to be raised up and be the highest place on earth. And verse 12, and this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Let me stop, because this can get a little confusing, because it's not strictly chronological. We're jumping back and forth to the Battle of Armageddon, when God comes to destroy the Antichrist and Satan, to the millennial reign. So there's time gaps between in the middle of this prophecy. We're switching back and forth. So you got to be on your toes and understand which exact time period are we talking about. Are we talking about the end of the tribulation period, or are we talking about the millennial reign, which follows the tribulation period? So here we just talked about the topography during the millennial reign. We're going back to talking about how God is going to defeat the armies that have come against Jerusalem. Does that make sense? I think that I sense that this can be confusing, because we're going back and forth between really good things and really bad things. And you got to understand that it's not strictly linear in time that Zechariah has given us this prophecy. It's an overall encompassing prophecy. And he's talking about two different time periods. Although they're related, they're two different time periods. So now we're going back to talking about that last portion of the tribulation period, when Jesus comes back to destroy Satan and the Antichrist. Did that make any sense? Or I'm just talking for myself? That's fine too.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
A question. So when you're looking at all the different comparisons between Zechariah, Daniel, and Revelations, are we to assume that Revelations has the true timeline, or how, or is there anything missing in Zechariah and Daniel, or do they
Yes,
follow?
that's a great question. That's a great question.
Yeah.
Because Zechariah and Daniel are written to the Jewish nation, not to the church.
Right.
The church was not in view in Zechariah or in Daniel.
But it's forced.
Because if you'll recall in the New Testament, the Gentile church is a mysterion, right? We're a mystery that they had no clue of in the Old Testament. So the prophets to the in the Old Testament are prophesying for the Jews. And so they're focused on what's going to happen to the Jews. So they're not even considering what's happening to the church. That is in Revelation. You're right.
So in the Old Testament, then, is there any indication of the new church?
Yes.
Okay.
There are indications. There are shadows and foretellings, and we've been going through some of them on Sunday mornings. But one of the, for instance, the rapture. You can find the rapture foreshadowed in the book of Song of Solomon, right? You can find it in Isaiah. It's there. You got to dig for it, but it's there. But the Jews wouldn't have understood that, right? But we can look back on it through the Holy Spirit and see, hey, yes, this is a foreshadowing of the church. We talked about it when Elijah went to the Gentile woman in Zarephath, right? And when Jesus used that to tell the Pharisees that he's going to go get for himself a Gentile people. He said, just as there was many widows in Elijah's day, he wasn't sent to any of the Jewish widows. He was sent to the Gentile widow. In other words, the Jews rejected my messenger, so he went to the Gentiles. And that's what Jesus is telling them. I come to you, you're going to reject me, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. But in Zechariah and in Daniel, no, the Gentile church was not in view. So they're prophesying specifically to the Jewish nation. And their prophecies are centered about what will happen to the Jewish nation. John in the book of Revelation tells us what happens to the church. That church that Zechariah had no clue of, that church that Daniel did not have in view. So yes, there are slight differences in the timeline because John gives us a more detailed timeline about the entire period of the tribulation period. And he spent all of chapter 19, 20, 21, and 22 talking about this period that Zechariah is presenting to us in chapter 14. Right? Did that help? Did that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Pastor Jeff, why is it do you think that this book keeps jumping back and forth?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. There are theories, there are thoughts, and I'm sure Christian could probably speak to this more than I could, because there is warfare going on here. And so while God is presenting information, he is also wanting to confuse certain parties, right? Doesn't want to make it easy for the enemy to figure out, for instance. Now that's one thought. And I don't really know why, right? Maybe just to get us to dig our heels in and study, right? Maybe that's part and parcel of it. If you want to understand it, you've got to think about it. Right. Verse 12, and this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. And so that goes right along with what Jenny was suggesting, maybe possibly something nuclear, something strange is how God is going to win that battle. And we see from the book of Revelation, it's just simply a word. Jesus speaks a word of his mouth and all this stuff happens, right? People just melt away like they've been in a nuclear explosion. And on that day, a great panic from the Lord shall fall on them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of the other. Even Judah will fight at Jerusalem. And the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold and silver, garments in great abundance, and a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses and the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beast may be in those camps. So the word that Jesus speaks, that John tells us about in Revelation, results in this destruction of whatever means and whatever means that God is using to accomplish that. It's some kind of energy, right? Some kind of energy that causes them, and it also causes them to fight amongst themselves. When else did that happen? Go back to your Sunday school lessons. Anybody remember Gideon? What God calls Gideon to do? Right? Whittle down the army to nobody, to 300 people, and surround the camp, blow the trumpets and, break the pot so they see all these fires and hear all the noise around the camp. And what does the enemy do? They panic and start fighting each other. That's what seems to happen here in the Antichrist's army when this is going on. Verse 16, then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come up against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. All right, who are those who survived the tribulation period? It's the believers, correct? That's what we figured out in the book of Revelation, and that's what Zechariah is indicating, that there will be survivors to survive that day of the second coming. And those are the ones who will inhabit the millennial reign. And here it indicates that the nations of the world will be required to come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Feast of Booths is a fall festival. Does anybody recall what the Feast of Booths celebrate? And that look back on, it remembers something, it celebrates something, it looks forward to something.
I think it's to look forward to when God would live with them or tabernacle with them.
Yes, they tabernacled with God. And booths or tabernacle simply means tents. It's the Feast of Tents. So I know the Murrays will enjoy this. They're going to go up in their tent. They're going to pitch a tent in Jerusalem, right? Today, during the Feast of Booths, Jewish people all over the world build a little shack or shelter out of twigs and stuff in their yard to symbolize when they were wandering the wilderness for 40 years and the presence of God lived with them in a tabernacle, in a tent. And so it looks back on that and celebrates the fact that God chose to dwell with them. And it looks forward to the time when God will again choose to dwell with his people. That's during the millennial reign. And it's not only going to be opened for Jews. In other words, what this is indicating is God is not only choosing to live with the Jews, he's choosing to live with all of humanity. This is why all of humanity, all races, are required to come to Jerusalem to celebrate this festival, because it celebrates the fact that God himself is there and he is living with us. And if any of the families, verse 17, if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. This shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. And on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of the house of the horses, holy to the Lord, and on the pots in the house of the Lord shall be as the pots before the altar. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come, take them, and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. And there shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. That's simply saying that in the millennial reign, the nation of Israel and all of their belongings will be holy, will be dedicated to the Lord. That's what that means, that they will be totally dedicated to the Lord, that God will wipe away all sinfulness out of the nation of Israel, that he'll wipe away all evil from the nation of Israel, and they will be totally dedicated to him. And so thus ends the book of Zechariah. And I know chapter 14 is a little difficult, and we might have went a little too fast. I don't know. So we left time for questions.
Do you have any idea why the topography is going to be changed, like the valley between the mountain? Okay. I'm just curious.
No, other than the fact, I'll give you a good, well thought out guess. Okay, if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, and we talk about the flood of Noah, right? God sends a flood, and part and parcel of that flood is that the deep broke open, right? And so that's where our mountains come from. Now go back to your high school or college geography or geology. We have something called Pangea, right? It was the one continent that all the current continents came from. And if you look at a map, a real map, not the ones we have, because those are stylized, you may not realize that the map you have, the globes you have, that's not the actual sizes of those continents. They're not to scale. Truly to scale. But if you look at one that's to scale, you can fit the pieces together like a puzzle. My mother just finished a puzzle. It's a beautiful puzzle, but she called me when she got it because somebody gave it to her, gifted it to her. I guess it's a new thing. It's a puzzle without borders, without an edge. So it's not a square puzzle. So you know how you do a puzzle, you always start with the edges first. Well, this one didn't have that. So you just gotta work it. But she did it, and it's really pretty. She sent me a picture. But you can place the continents together like a puzzle. And you see that at one time, at initial creation, during Adam and Eve's time and all the way up to the flood, it was one continent. And it seems to be not very mountainous. But then when the deep broke open, the skies let loose, the water canopy let loose, and the waters of the deep broke open, it seems that all of those geological processes that God used to split up the world is what caused the mountain ranges, right? That's why you can go to any mountain range in the world, and on top of it, you can find sea fossils, right? You find fossilized sea creatures. Well, what are they doing on top of the mountain? Well, it didn't used to be a mountain, right? It was thrust up at one point. And then we're also told that in the millennial and in the hereafter the millennial, there will be no sea. Now, I don't think that's talking about the Sea of Galilee. I don't think it's talking about little bodies of water. I think it's what it's talking about is these divided oceans. So I think it's going to come back to just how it was created, right? Which was virtually, I don't want to say flat. It's probably hilly, but no huge mountain ranges, except Jerusalem is going to be the highest place on earth. And that makes sense because Jesus is going to be sitting on the throne right in the middle of Jerusalem. So that's my guess. It doesn't.
Thank you. Yeah, that was
tell us
helpful.
that. But you know, and I think we talked about part of that is that God is going to, the part of the millennial reign, part of what's going on there is we're going to once again re-inhabit Eden, or humanity will once again re-inhabit Eden as it should have been, as it was created to be. So he's going to remake Eden. So that makes sense to me. Does that make sense to anybody else besides me and Jenny? Because Christian's eating, he can't do nothing. What Jenny fixed tonight?
Frito pie.
She's
With
such a godly
venison.
woman. She cooks for her man every night. I had to fix my own tonight.